Night. A quiet street. A mother stands frozen behind a fence, her breath caught in her chest. Inside the house across the yard, the lights are on. Children are laughing. Not crying. Laughing. A door opens slightly, warm light spilling out, and a voice calls the twins' names, perfectly, the same way she used to at bedtime. In that instant, her stomach drops. Her children aren't missing. They're inside that house, and they're answering to someone else. In that moment, she realizes something far more painful than fear. Her children weren't lost. They were choosing somewhere else. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Our Grace Miller lived on a street people described as quiet and safe, the kind where neighbors waved and kids rode bikes in slow circles. She was a widow, though the word still felt foreign in her mouth. Since her husband died, time had lost its shape. Days blurred. Nights stretched. Her 4-year-old twins, Eli and Noah, were the only reason she kept moving. Even then it was mechanical. Dinner routines broke down into cereal at night and half-eaten plates left on the table. Some evenings Grace stood in the kitchen staring at the stove, unable to remember why she turned it on. Grief didn't arrive as tears anymore. It arrived as numbness, as forgetting, as silence where laughter used to live. Eli and Noah felt the change before she ever said it out loud. They clung to her legs, asked where Daddy was, and asked why Mommy slept on the couch now. Grace answered softly, always softly, even when her chest burned. She told herself this was survival, not failure. That love was still enough, even if energy wasn't. But there was a weight in the air that week, something unseen pressing in. She would later realize with a clarity that hurt to remember, this was the last week her children belonged only to her. The first time the twins disappeared, it didn't feel like an emergency. It felt ordinary, almost forgettable. Grace noticed the house was too quiet one afternoon, the kind of quiet that sneaks up on you. She checked the backyard. Empty. The front porch. Empty. Then she saw them down the street, small figures moving between familiar houses. Neighbors waved as they passed, smiling like everything was normal. Or Grace felt a flicker of relief and forced herself to breathe. 10 minutes later, Eli and Noah came back on their own, cheeks flushed, laughing about something that didn't include her. Their shoes were dusty, more than a walk down the sidewalk would explain, but Grace didn't ask. She told herself she was imagining things. They were just children. The pattern repeated. Not every day, just often enough to feel accidental. Sometimes they were gone for 15 minutes. Sometimes closer to half an hour. Always close to 4:40 in the afternoon, though Grace wouldn't realize that mattered until much later. They returned happy, full of stories that trailed off when she asked where they'd been. Grace nodded, distracted, exhausted. She told herself freedom was good for them, that she couldn't wrap her grief around their childhood too tightly. Still, or each time she wiped dirt from their shoes, a quiet question sat in her chest, unanswered. Grace didn't decide to start watching the clock. It happened without permission, like a reflex. Her eyes drifted to it while she brushed her teeth, while she folded laundry, while she stood in the hallway doing nothing at all. She missed phone calls because the sound startled her out of counting minutes. Somewhere along the way, she stopped cooking dinner after a certain hour. The stove left cold, as if heat might invite something she couldn't name. By late afternoon, she found herself sitting still, listening, waiting for footsteps or laughter or the click of the front door. Time began to feel heavy instead of neutral. Minutes stretched thin, then snapped. When the house grew quiet, Grace told herself not to look outside, not to search the street. If she didn't look, maybe nothing bad would exist. That thought became a rule she lived by. She stayed seated, hands folded, heart racing, pretending stillness was control. And when the twins finally came back, smiling like nothing had happened, relief washed over her so completely that it almost felt like proof she'd been wrong to worry at all. The first real spike of fear came disguised as waiting. One evening, the twins didn't return when they usually did. 5 minutes passed, and Grace told herself not to panic. 12 minutes, and her stomach tightened. By 18, her thoughts ran ahead of her. Police lights flashing against neighboring houses. A knock at the door. Headlines she couldn't stop forming in her mind. She stood by the window, hands pressed together, whispering their names like it might pull them back. Then the door opened. Eli and Noah stepped inside, smiling, breathless, untouched by the storm she'd just lived through. Relief hit so hard her knees weakened. She pulled them close, almost crying, until she noticed what Noah was holding. A small object. Clean. New. Something she hadn't bought, hadn't seen before. When she asked where it came from, they shrugged, already distracted. Grace let it go. She told herself calm was restored. But the object stayed, sitting quietly in the house, waiting to matter later. Grace entered denial the way people do when fear feels too expensive to carry. She told herself she was paranoid, that grief was distorting her judgment. When she mentioned it to friends, they smiled gently and said the same thing. Kids wander, kids explore. This is a safe street. Grace nodded along, repeating their words until they sounded like her own. She laughed at herself, made jokes about being overprotective, even though her chest stayed tight when the house went quiet. She lied carefully, not just to the people around her, but to herself. She smoothed over the gaps in her memory. She ignored the objects that appeared without explanation. She pretended the waiting was normal. And as you listen to this, you might wonder if you would have done the same, if you'd chosen comfort over suspicion just to get through another day. What she didn't know, what no one had told her yet, was that someone had been waiting for them long before she noticed. The first time Grace tried to follow them, she told herself she would be casual. No rushing, no calling their names, just a few steps behind, far enough to feel invisible. The twins walked ahead, small hands swinging, turning corners she'd walked 100 times before. Then, in the space of a breath, they were gone. Not running, not hiding, just gone. Grace's heart slammed hard enough to steal the air from her lungs. Her vision narrowed, the street tilting as she fought to stay upright, fingers digging into her coat as a wave of panic took over. She turned in a slow circle, whispering their names, afraid to raise her voice. And then, behind her, came their laughter. Eli and Noah stood there like they'd never left, looking up at her with calm faces. When she asked where they'd been, Noah tilted his head and said, "You walk too loud, Mommy." The words landed wrong, too precise, too learned. Grace smiled, but something inside her went cold, because she knew children don't invent rules like that on their own. After that, Grace started noticing the house. Not up close, never close. Just from a distance, the way you notice something when you don't want to admit you're watching it. The lights were always on every evening, glowing soft and steady at the same hour. Not harsh, not alarming. Warm, like dinner was always ready inside. The timing never changed. It was as if the house itself kept a schedule. It didn't look abandoned. The yard was neat. Curtains drawn just enough to suggest privacy, not neglect. And yet, Grace never saw anyone go in or out. No car pulling into the driveway, no visitors, no movement at all, except for the twins. Eli and Noah drifted toward it without hesitation, like they recognized something familiar long before she did. Grace watched from across the street, her pulse loud in her ears. By now, you're probably expecting danger, expecting something obvious and threatening to reveal itself. But what unsettled her most was how ordinary it all looked. The house didn't feel wrong. It felt inviting. And that made it harder to understand why her instincts were begging her to look away. Then came the second spike, the one that stripped away any pretense of calm. One evening, the twins didn't come back. 30 minutes passed. 45. Grace's chest tightened with every second. She called their names over and over, her voice cracking as it bounced against the quiet houses. The street, once familiar, now felt wrong, like the shadows had shifted, like the pavement itself was pressing in. Every corner looked like it could hide something she didn't want to see. Every window stared back, blank and silent. Her mind raced through possibilities she didn't dare speak aloud. Panic finally broke through. She ran. Fast, stumbling over curbs, calling their names, her heart hammering in her throat. Feet pounding, breath ragged, eyes scanning every yard, every doorway. The world narrowed to the absence of her children, and in that moment, she realized fear had taken a form she couldn't control. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Grace slowed her pace, forcing herself to be quiet this time. Every step was deliberate, footsteps soft against the gravel, her breath shallow, uneven. The fence she passed creaked under her fingertips as if testing her patience. Somewhere behind a closed door, a hint of laughter drifted out, high and familiar. Eli and Noah were inside, or near it, but she couldn't see them yet. Her chest tightened. Her mind raced, on imagining every possibility and none at all. She stayed just out of sight, hugging the shadows, straining for sound. The world around her became sharp and narrow, the scrape of a shoe on stone, the whisper of wind in the trees, the faint giggle that made her stomach drop. She wanted to rush in, to call their names, to demand answers. But something told her to wait, to watch, to let the fear settle like a weight she couldn't shake. And so she waited, every second stretching unbearably long, while the twins moved somewhere just beyond her reach, unseen, untouched, leaving the audience wondering what would happen next. Then she heard it, a voice inside the house. Male, calm, smooth, measured, as if reading from a script meant only for them. He knew the twins' nicknames. He even said her husband's name aloud. Grace froze. That name hadn't been spoken out loud in months. Her chest seized. Her hands gripped the fence so tightly the wood bit into her skin. Part of her wanted to run. Part of her wanted to burst through the door. Cautiously, she leaned closer to a window, straining to see without being seen. Inside, the scene was deceptively ordinary. A warm table set for dinner. Drawings pinned on the wall. That small object the twins had brought home before, sitting untouched on a shelf. Eli and Noah were there, laughing softly, safe in every way a child could be. The man's face remained hidden in the shadows. Grace's mind spun. She felt relief, confusion, and fear all at once. And in that gray space, she asked herself, is this wrong? If the children are happy? Grace stepped inside, careful, her footsteps light against the wooden floor. Yet the warmth of the house hit her immediately, the smell of baked bread and crayons wrapping around her like a memory she didn't want to leave. The man turned as soon as she entered. No shock, no fear. Just recognition, quiet and certain. They've been coming for weeks, he said, voice soft, steady. I didn't want to steal them. I just didn't want them to forget. Grace's breath caught. The words didn't carry anger, didn't plead for forgiveness. They simply explained, as if the truth alone could hold weight. Her eyes went to the twins, safe, smiling, unaware of the tension that hung between the adults. And in that moment, Grace realized the story wasn't simple, that right and wrong were tangled, and that love sometimes took forms you weren't prepared to understand. Grace's eyes adjusted to the dim corner where the man stood, and suddenly the pieces clicked. He wasn't a stranger. He had been close to her late husband, someone who knew the family stories, the little habits only parents notice. The way Noah's laugh caught in the back of his throat. How Eli always twirled his blanket before sleep. Every word, every movement carried that knowledge. He explained why the twins had come to him. They weren't lost. They hadn't been taken. They had been missing pieces of attention, guidance, and presence their mother couldn't give while drowning in exhaustion and grief. He had given them stability, warmth, and quiet understanding. Grace felt her fear unravel into grief, her suspicion melt into shame. The man she had assumed was a threat was, in truth, a guardian. And the children she thought she'd been failing had been living in a world that held both love and care, and just in a form she hadn't recognized. Grace sank into a chair, her hands pressed to her face as the weight of it all settled. She realized, painfully, what had gone wrong, not in the obvious ways, but in the quiet, invisible ones. She had stopped speaking about their father. The stories that once filled bedtime had vanished. She had stopped remembering out loud, stopped sharing laughter and memory with the twins, as if holding it all inside would protect them. And now she understood. They weren't disappearing. They were searching for something she had buried. The warmth, the connection, the small details of a father's love she hadn't kept alive. The realization tore through her. Her grief deepened, but it was tinged with clarity. Shame and sorrow mixed. But beneath it all, there was a seed of understanding. Love sometimes needs to be spoken, remembered, and shared, or else it drifts elsewhere, even to the people who care the most. After long conversations, careful agreements, and boundaries drawn with trembling hands, Grace began to see a path forward. The man would continue to guide and care for the twins, but only within the limits they had all agreed on. Slowly, the tension in the house eased. Grace learned to step back without letting go completely, to trust without abandoning her role as their mother. Finally, the twins spoke, their small voices breaking the silence that had stretched for months. Eli looked up at her, then at the man who had been part of their world and said quietly, "He makes Daddy feel real." Grace felt her chest tighten, a mix of heartbreak and relief washing over her. It was a moment of clarity, bitter and tender at the same time, a reminder that love doesn't always come in the form you expect, and that sometimes letting go is the only way to truly hold on. Months later, Grace found herself standing by the window again, watching the clock tick toward the same hour she had once feared. The lights in the neighboring house glowed warm and steady, the laughter of her children drifting softly through the air. Only now, there was no fear, no panic, just a quiet understanding that the world had shifted and that love could take unexpected forms. She never followed them again. Not because she didn't care, not because she had stopped worrying, but because she finally understood where they were going and why it mattered. Her heart ached and softened at the same time, a bittersweet acceptance that some lessons can only be learned in the quiet. And now, we leave you with this. What would you have done in her place?